Today we're going to put a temporary hold on work in the port of Amaranth Bay and return for a while to the downtown. You may remember that we had this big stretch of grid left over from a previous build, and today we're going to get to work filling this in with a mix of moderate and low-density development to give the city a much-needed boost in population. We'll start with a small extension of the downtown using the familiar style of building from when we've been working in this area, mostly using wall-to-wall brick buildings with some lots having been torn down and turned into parking lots. Visually speaking, the main point of this build is going to be to transition from the denser and more asphalt-heavy downtown, which you can see very clearly from above, to the less dense and greener historic neighborhoods surrounding it. Looking at Google Maps, my eye is always drawn to this kind of distinction, at least in your typical North American city, like Duluth, which is not typical in some ways, but is very typical in others. That's probably true of any city. Anyway, so I wanted to make sure that we have a nice amount of these more asphalt-heavy blocks before working on the blocks that are going to more transition from the downtown into the lower-density neighborhoods. Of course, that also requires some alleyway-type detailing with a bunch of dumpsters, damaged decals, a few varieties of pavement surfaces, and probably way too many parking spots, all the usual exciting things you find in an alley. I didn't want to just have parking lots and 1 or 2 story brick buildings though, so I also am going to put down a couple of more modern apartments as we work on these areas, serving as infill, kind of like what we did back in episode 11 with the hillside neighborhood build. I'm thinking that these kinds of apartments would have sprung up as the city started redeveloping old industrial land into attractions and offices, like the Canal Park area, the big waterfront entertainment district, the office park, and the Freshwater Research Institute from a couple episodes ago, and probably a lot of other things that we're going to build in the future that I just simply don't have planned yet. Since the downtown and its surroundings are all within walking or at least streetcar distance of all these areas, it would probably make sense that they'd want to encourage housing development here rather than in the suburbs to take advantage of all this pre-existing infrastructure and transportation. And this is a fantasy world after all, so they're able to easily adjust their zoning laws, their parking requirements, and that sort of thing, and just make this kind of development happen. Sounds nice, doesn't it? In contrast to all of that theorizing, one way I wanted to begin transitioning away from the denser downtown was to begin mixing in some lower density commercial lots as we go. So here we have this church, which isn't really a commercial building per se, but I think the design principles here are pretty much the same. With a dedicated and very steep parking lot, surrounded by manicured grass and some trees. The same goes for this big apartment building next door, although in this case it's more of a small landscaped lot, and it has a below-ground parking garage rather than a surface lot, which is great because it means that I don't have to plop down a bunch more parking spots. And also it's better land use, I guess. Another element that I wanted to integrate into these transition blocks are historic buildings. This is going to play a larger role in future episodes, but today I wanted to focus on this firehouse that they have in Duluth, which I actually mentioned in a previous episode, and someone suggested that I could make it into a museum, since I did want to use it in some capacity, and I thought that was a good idea, so I did it. This asset actually has kind of a similar look to the one in Duluth, so I'm going to use this, just adjusting the color in PO, first to get the nice red doors, and also to match the brick to the darker and very tasty looking brick color you get in so many of these older Duluth buildings. And then I'm going to take a couple copies of this building and distort them in PO to replicate the little annex that you see behind it in Duluth. Finally, I'm covering up the ugly distortion up here on the roof with a roof prop because it's way easier than fiddling around with a bunch of tiny vertices and getting something that doesn't even look good at the end anyway. Since this is meant to be a museum, I'm going to put down a historic fire engine out front, which I totally remembered to download before doing this build. And then I'm going to clip a tech museum block into the main building, which I thought was the closest match out of the museums that come with the campus DLC. So hopefully that's going to draw a nice amount of traffic over here. I did actually end up coming back later and adding a couple of historic fire engines in, so keep an eye out for those in the cinematics. I mentioned back in episode 11 that Duluth has a number of brick apartments interspersed with single-family homes in the equivalent area to where we're working, and that's going to be the main technique I use to transition to the lower density areas. So there's a great concentration of these apartments right as you leave downtown, and then as you go farther and farther down the grid, away from the skyline, they get much less frequent, although there are going to be some places in future episodes where they kind of spring back up again farther away, but that's a story for another day. These kinds of blocks are also going to have a lot more of these grand old trees, which I think will kind of be the low density equivalent to all the gray asphalt that you get in the denser blocks. As usual, I struggled to get just the right amount of foliage, but I think the technique that works best is just to put down as many as I think the block can handle, not think about it too much, and then I'm going to go through later and thin them out a bit, size them down as needed. But I do want these streets to feel nice and leafy and feel like these old neighborhoods. Because we're working on a relatively steep hill here, I'm going to have to adjust basically every single building that I place down to make sure that there isn't excessive terrain distortion. Usually that's going to involve just pushing the houses back a little bit from the road and raising them up. I mostly end up raising them just a single large unit with Move It, so holding down Shift and then hitting Page Up, and that generally seems to be about the right amount to get it halfway up the slope for each half block. The biggest problem with that is that it decouples the built-in paths from the sidewalk on these pre-decorated houses at least. So for these areas that are a little bit more visible, I'm going to take the time to manually extend the paths back up to the sidewalk because these kinds of spots are more likely to show up in the cinematics. Sometimes I also take the time to put down a handful of garages in the alleys, which I think is kind of a typical pre-war layout where you won't have driveways out front, you'll just have street parking, and then instead you'll have garage add-ons in the alleys. I tried doing this with IMT, but I couldn't really do it in a way that worked and looked good and was easy to do. And I kind of got lazy plopping them manually, so they sort of went the way of the pathways where I'm only going to put them down where I think that they'll be seen. And now that we've run out of grid on this side of town, it's time to fill in the rest of these blocks and call it a day. Actually, no, I love grids. I know that you love grids, so we're going to scale this build up a little bit. At this point, I took another look at Duluth and realized that my plans so far didn't include enough of these nice old brick buildings, which I think make as much of an impact on the satellite view as they do down at street level. So with the road network extended all the way out to the ravine, which is going to serve as kind of a nice natural border to this part of town, I wanted to start filling all this in with a bunch of brick apartments and other sorts of buildings. Although there are going to be a few more iconic and unique buildings on this side of town, and that's something we're going to focus on more in a future video. We do have this hotel in this video, which we'll get to detailing in a second. Most of these are just going to be kind of the rank and file buildings that are going to flesh out the neighborhood and hopefully get us the right aerial view once all of this is said and done. Alongside the brick apartments, I wanted to include two types of single-family homes. The first type is the grand historic mansion, which you find a lot of on the east side of Duluth, and I think were built by people who got rich off of the developing industry in the early days of the city. These kinds of houses use an eclectic mix of architectural styles, so you have some Tudor Revival, Queen Anne's, and so on. So I'm using my collection of that sort of building to put down a few of those, and then any spots that are left, I'm going to place down the second type, which is really just drawing from my collection of standard pre-war Midwest houses, or the kinds of houses that can kind of fit into that vein. Looking back at it now, I do think that my selection of assets in this last category wasn't perfect, not because they're not good assets, they're all really nice assets, but because I don't think they really fully capture the variety of silhouettes that you get from these buildings in Duluth. So I may take a look at that later on in the series and make some adjustments there. But the important part for now is that we've established a basic blueprint for how to develop the rest of the neighborhood. One handy way I found to cut back on the worst effects of my tree addiction was to alternate it with my other addiction, which is building parking lots. So for some of the larger apartment blocks, I'm going to add in these tiny lots off of the alleys. Usually this involves taking another copy of each building and lowering it down to compensate for the steep terrain, and then adding in a door or a pathway to a door that's built into the asset to create a functional looking entrance. So not only does this create some breaks in the dense foliage, but it also adds a little bit of realism to have some parking requirements for these multifamily homes. Even though I was kind of joking about the whole tree and parking lot addiction thing, I think it does actually sort of summarize what my options are for detailing this kind of neighborhood, at least for the interiors of the blocks where most of the space that needs to be filled in is. Now, I don't really mind doing a build like that, especially when you have some more convoluted areas to detail, like this steep block here with the hotel that I mentioned before. But I think it does get a little bit stale after a while. So at some point, I'm going to have to think a bit harder about how far I actually want to extend out in this same style of development from the downtown before we transition into all the different things that I have planned for outside the urban core. So post-war neighborhoods, modern commercial developments, parks, services, unique builds, and so on. I also have to decide how much detail I want to put into these more repetitive areas, like the many, many blocks of single-family homes that we still have to put down. Oh boy. Ideally, I'd like to not spend a bunch of time fiddling with repetitive things like driveways, pathways, alleys, all the trees in between the houses, because these just aren't that important to the overall look of the city. So if I don't spend a bunch of time doing that, then I can put more detailing time into unique buildings like this hotel. Because I'm just thinking back to, like, in Todos Santos, I had massive suburbs that I didn't spend that much time making, and they looked fine from a distance, I think, but there was basically no detail at all, and if you zoomed in on them, they didn't look that great. So I guess I'm still trying to find a balance that's maybe somewhat more detailed than that, but still allows me to build neighborhoods quickly as we expand the city. So I'm going to spend some time thinking about that and maybe doing some experiments. And if you have any ideas for how I can more efficiently spend my time and, maybe that could lead to making more videos, I don't know. Do let me know in the comments. I would definitely appreciate that. In contrast to all the concern about parking lots and repetitiveness, I wanted to finish off the hotel with some good old-fashioned detailing, mostly to integrate it better with the surroundings. I'm going to add some small planters around the base using these brick wall pieces, which I made a bit bluer to try to match them with the tone of brick of the hotel asset. It wasn't a full success, but I think it's close enough that the difference doesn't pop quite as much. Finally, it gets some bigger, older trees along the street that were probably planted when the original building was erected, and some smaller trees in the more recent parking lot, which was dropped like an anvil on some poor collection of old buildings that were deemed less valuable than a literal strip of asphalt. So with this cute little extension of downtown done, I got to work putting down a lot, and I mean a lot, of houses. In fact, I recorded so much footage of this that I couldn't fit it into this video without inflating the runtime to hilarious proportions. Don't worry though, if you do want to see me put down every single house, I edited all that footage into a separate time-lapse video, which I'll link down in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video despite some of the reservations that I had about the build. Let me know if you have any thoughts as to how I should manage balancing detail and expansion for these more sprawling neighborhoods. Thank you to my channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellen. And thank you for watching.